Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of A Foggy Day on Olympus. My name's Mike Pierce, and this is the third session in our series on Israel and Jewish history. And today we're going to be looking at the topic, Enabling the Holocaust, What Created Antisemitism?
And my name is Coel Campo, and I want to welcome you to A Foggy Day on Olympus, where we explore history, religion, and culture. For those who are not fully up to speed on their classical references, Mount Olympus was the place where, as you suddenly now remember, the Greek gods lived. So an Olympian judgment is an assessment that is utterly dispassionate, impartial, and delivered from far above the mad squabbling of mere mortals. It's what we aspire to, of course, but, you know, the fog. So today we begin with this question that I have for you as we, start looking at modern times and people are less and less religious. The supposedly Christian arguments, such as Luther's that we looked at last week for attacking Jews, would seem to disappear. Yet in modern times we've had the Holocaust. So Hitler and the others weren't necessarily appealing to people's religious prejudices. So where does modern anti-Semitism come from?
Okay, well, that's our central question today. And of course, it's a very embarrassing fact that anti-Semitism was so prevalent, certainly right across Europe and North America. It doesn't really start to diminish drastically until about the 1960s. And of course, now it's on the rise again over a completely different kind of agenda. Anti-Semitism wasn't simply a problem in Germany and further east. It was there in America and in Britain. And anybody old enough with long enough memories will be able to testify to that fact. So why is it there? Well, back when I used to teach classes on this and related material, one little hand grenade I used to like to chuck at students pretty early on was the question, given that East Central Europe was not populated principally by psychopaths, right? Why were so many people prepared to support the Nazis in World War II? And there are basically three answers to that. The first one is the immense dislocation, the economic suffering, and the new resentments created by the destruction of the old empires in 1918 at the end of the First World War. I mean, that's a vast subject in itself, and we can't deal with it at all today, except perhaps a little obliquely. Secondly, fear of communism. And the third one is this widespread and very long-standing anti-Semitism. But it had adopted a modern form. The religious stuff had mostly drifted into the background, except in parts of the Russian Empire before World War I. And a fair amount of it comes down to economic jealousy. The experience of the Middle Ages left Jews with three really big advantages as the world modernizes and we move into the modern age with commerce and industry and so on. In the first place, they had centuries of experience and expertise in commerce because medieval society kind of boxed them out from the main activity then, which was agriculture. Right? And so they had loads of experience that we passed down generations, especially in finance. The second thing is they had a wide range of trusted trans-local contacts who were also Jewish. And this is where we really need an effort of mind to see what life was like for ordinary people in pre-modern times. I mean, look at you and me right now, okay? This conversation is going on across the Atlantic. Both of us know loads of people outside of our own countries, right? And I've encountered many, many more than that. Well, most people in pre-modern times living in small villages, it's been calculated, would never have met more than a couple of hundred other individuals in their entire lives, right? And certainly would not have had significant translocal contacts. But Jews did, and that puts them at a huge advantage when the economy is becoming more and more concerned with trade, moving raw materials around, moving finance, and so on. And also, Jews had a much higher average literacy and educational level than the general population. And this will come up time and time again, I'm sure, in these podcasts, that it's the averages that count. Anybody could point to a whole load of highly educated Gentiles and a bunch of completely illiterate Jews. That's not the point. It's the average that counts. And when we look at the average, then we see that Jews are far more literate and numerate, and so able to engage with the new opportunities being created by a modernising world. And that makes people jealous of them, because they have then disproportionately large influence, and particularly when it comes to the newly created prosperity.
And can you remind us, why is it that Jews have all these centuries of commercial experience?
Well, the Middle Ages is, this is going to sound like a caricature, but we're dealing with a vast period in just a couple of sentences here. It's largely a pyramid landholding scheme. That's what feudal society is. And although there's been a movement away from that in more recent centuries, say from the 16th century onwards, 15th century really in Britain, or in England anyway, there's been a movement away from that. Still, that kind of society is the staple of the economy. 95% of everybody is engaged in producing enough food to feed 100%, right? And Jews were locked out of that. And so the only way to keep body and soul together in that kind of circumstance is to engage in selling stuff. Now that's a small niche in the economy, but it's also an important one. And in modern times, it becomes a larger and larger share of the economy, and Jews are right at the core of that from the beginning. They had been pushed around because that situation too had created economic jealousies as well as religious prejudices. And by the time we get to the 19th century, more and more of them are in East Central Europe. So this pie chart here shows that by the time we get to 1880 at least, 75% of world Jewry are living in Eastern Europe, right? And a little bit more than half the remainder in the rest of Europe. The Americas at that stage only a very small share, but that was about to shoot up sharply, as people who know their American history will be well aware. In the 1890s and early 20th century, there's a huge movement of Jews, particularly from Eastern Europe, to North America. So modernity offers Jews huge opportunities because of this kind of incubated background in the Middle Ages. They certainly favoured modernisation. For them, most of them, Europe couldn't modernise fast enough. They were all in favour of the demise of the divine right of kings type states with absolutist monarchs, or even semi-governing monarchs, and the churchly power that attended it. What underpinned divine right monarchy in Orthodox and Catholic and indeed Protestant states was the idea of a state church which everybody was supposed to belong to, and which said, this is the will of God. To rebel against the king is to sin against God, and so on. So Jews couldn't wait to see the end of that, because obviously it had given them a bad time. And from the time of the French Revolution onwards, you get legal emancipation, first in France and then through the 19th century in most other countries in Europe. That is, that they become equal under the law with other people in the countries where they live. And that encouraged a lot of Jews to gravitate to these new professions that were becoming more and more important. The law, journalism, because you've got an increasingly literate public, an appetite for newspapers, magazines and so on, and very large numbers of Jews involved in journalism, and therefore influencing public opinion at a time when public opinion is starting to become important as more and more states move progressively towards more and more democratic or popular input into politics and medicine for that matter. But also nationalism, at least potentially, We tend to think now, well, gosh, surely nationalism can't have favoured Jews. But in the 19th century, it seemed that it would, because it was defining the political community potentially, perhaps, in ways that might include Jews rather than exclude them by definition. Right? So if we're in pre-revolutionary France, where the Catholic Church is the mainstay of the monarchy, then Jews are outsiders by definition. But if we're defining France in terms of the people who live in France and speak French, well, maybe that includes Jews. It didn't, in the long run, work out that way very often, but at least potentially. So for example, 1848 saw nationalist-inspired revolutions in many, many parts of Europe. They were all unsuccessful in the end, but they were there. The one in Venice against Austrian Habsburg rule was led by Daniele Manin, and he was a Jewish lawyer. So nationalism potentially included them. And Jews were most aligned with the modernist political parties that wanted the most drastic break with tradition. So it looked like modernity would be a good thing for them. And I tremble to say this because, of course, we can't possibly forget the Holocaust, but maybe on balance it has been. I don't know, what could possibly outbalance the Holocaust? I don't know, but it's impossible to disregard it. But if we can just kind of put it in a siding for a moment, we can say that I guess it has been a good thing. But it's certainly created huge troubles.
So Jews really wanted to break away from these old political structures because they had suffered some really bad treatment from them. Right. Is that right?
Yes. So the more drastic the break with the past, the better most Jews liked it. But precisely that fact then makes them resented by people who were suffering from modernisation. Again, this is a vast topic, but we tend to overlook the fact that modernisation wasn't good for everybody. It's been good for us in the end. We can live like this, right? We've got all kinds of technical devices and material comforts, and we can talk to one another across the Atlantic and have friends, and there are people listening right now online and so on, and that's great. But actually making the break from traditional society in that direction was extremely traumatic for the large majority of people. And that large majority, therefore, are inclined to get annoyed at the minority for whom it can't happen fast enough.
So now with the rise of modernity, we see a new form of anti-Semitism.
Right, and it's based upon that resentment, not the old religious kind. Or at least the religious kind is sometimes still there, but it's drifting into the background. Sometimes a demagogue like Hitler will stir it up again, but it's not central to his arguments. It's just like an extra. Yeah. So the inclusion of Jews within the nation wasn't automatic, because Jewish names and language, to say nothing of customs or religion, set them apart. They were clearly different. And even now, lots of Jews, however well and completely assimilated they might be into American life or British life or French life, Swiss life, whatever, their names tend to stand out, and you meet someone and you think, I think you might be Jewish. Right? Well, that doesn't matter at all now, where amongst people who are not remotely anti-Semitic, it's just like a conjecture. I wonder if he is, if she is, right? But in a period where that attracted dislike, well, the standout was not always good. Sometimes it wasn't always possible to assimilate quite enough. And where later forms of nationalism took on religious definitions, Jews were automatically excluded.
So you're talking about later forms of nationalism and religious definitions. Can you sort of break some of this down and explain it for us?
Okay, well, generalising like crazy here, but that's pretty much all we've got time for. Before World War I, nationalism was overwhelmingly secular, even secularist, and religious institutions of all kinds, with the arguable and partial exception of Serbia, tended to be opposed to nationalism. Right? But after World War One, when basically the nationalists got what they wanted, ostensibly, nation states, think of President Wilson's national self-determination formula for redrawing the map of Europe after World War One. That didn't make the problem go away because there were minorities everywhere. It wasn't possible, it still isn't possible, to draw frontiers that can be completely fit with particular nationalities. And in some places, I don't want to overstate this, in some places religion then became important in defining and distinguishing particular ethnicities, but not everywhere. So, for example, Croatia would be one instance, and Romania would be another. So, yeah, nationalism sometimes taking on religious definitions, which automatically then excludes Jews. And after World War One, a lot of nationalism becomes, instead of a liberal force and a democratising force, becomes highly toxic, really, and militarist, and metamorphoses into fascism. That obviously is not very good for Jews. Although I want to stress here, contrary again to what we might think, because we all just think of the Nazi example because it looms so large, that not all fascism was even necessarily anti-Semitic. But that's a discussion for another time. But much of it was, certainly obviously in Germany, certainly in Croatia, certainly in Romania. And the large preponderance of Jews in the communist parties made them vulnerable to accusations that they were somehow entailed in a conspiracy against society as a whole. Why so many Jews in communist parties? Because communism was the most radical break of all from traditional society, and that appealed to at least some Jews. Right? It didn't mean we're all Jews communists, though that's what fascists between the wars and during the Second World War wanted people to believe, that if you're Jewish you must be a communist, which wasn't true. But certainly Jews were hugely overrepresented in communist parties in every country, including in Britain, including in America, by the way. So, new forms of anti-Semitism, new sticks to beat them with. But all coming, I suppose, from the common core point that modernisation was very traumatic for a lot of people, and so people who suffered under that, it was very easy for them to blame the Jews who benefited from it, at least in aggregate, and many of whom were in favour of the most modernising political forces.
And this has always been really interesting to me because I feel like as somebody walking into college as a college freshman, if you had asked me back then, is modernization a good thing? Is nationalism a good thing? I would have said, yeah, sure, we should be patriotic. We should be proud of America. Modernization is great. Like you mentioned, we have all of these comforts, but it's interesting, I think, learning the history and that things just didn't always work out as beautifully as we feel like they might have.
No, I'm afraid the modern world is built on trauma of all kinds and massive injustices. It's impossible and ridiculous to try and rectify those. We can't go back into the past. We have to deal with the people who are alive now, right? And patriotism, I would say, is an extremely good thing. Nationalism tends towards the view that the interests of my country are somehow more important than the interests of other people's countries and so on. So that's highly problematic. And of course, if we look at that then going several stages further, particularly in the interwar and Second World War period, then it's a lot more than problematic. It's catastrophic. So, yeah, the past isn't the way we would want it to be.
Much in the same way that my college career may have been slightly traumatic and slightly catastrophic due to the presence of...
Oh, me. But look at the wonderful results. It's like modernity as a whole.
Of course not.
What are you complaining
Well,
of?
that's all in the past now.
Yeah. All the tortures and torments. I'm now casting around for new people to give a hard time to. Or I could just keep on loading on you. Right. Okay, it's worth mentioning here that whilst the Jewish experience is extremely eye-catching, it's not completely unique. Back in 2004, a professor of law at Yale Law School, a lady called Amy Chua, brought out a best-selling book called World on Fire. And she coined the concept of what she called market-dominant minorities. She cited the example, obviously, of Jews in Europe, and to an extent in North America, the Chinese outside of China in Southeast Asia. So, for example, every single country in Southeast Asia, its economy is dominated pretty much by its ethnic Chinese minority. Indians in East Africa, it was the British during the British Empire who brought Indians as labourers to their East African colonies, and long afterwards the Indians, they too formed a market-dominant minority in those East African countries. But also Lebanese in various parts of the world, particularly in West Africa on the coasts, have a hugely disproportionate economic effect in trade and so on. Well, everywhere, she says, the result is similar. An inability of local economies to manage without this minority, but also huge resentment against that minority by honest sons of the soil and indigenous local people. So it's the same kind of phenomenon, and the reason it keeps working is that these people know one another, they're in touch with one another very frequently, they've got translocal contacts from right out of the area. Simply by virtue of having been locked out of all the normal ways of getting on and keeping yourself alive in those areas, they've developed a whole load of other skills which are extremely valuable, and that can make them rich, and that then makes them even more resented. So it's kind of like a vicious circle here.
Is this something that you think we still see in today's, market and economies? Because living in southeastern America, I can think of one or two industries that we certainly see a lot of minorities tend to be drawn towards, but maybe it's just an American, thing that we don't really have this anymore.
Well, it could certainly potentially start up again, whether to the Jews or anybody else. I think probably where the bulk of the population is reasonably comfortable, then those kinds of ethnic resentments based on economic jealousy are less likely to arise. But of course, we're entering now into a period where people are less and less comfortable, and most people think that their children are not going to be as well off as they are. Well, let's follow that further down the tube, and I think you can see that these things are already starting, or you could foresee that maybe within a decade or two that would get going again. Although, of course, as we've mentioned, anti-Semitism is on the rise now for a whole lot of other reasons, a lot of it connected with immigrants coming in much more to Europe than to America, but to America too, and also to disputes about the place of Israel in the world, which we'll get to in the next couple of episodes. Well, let's take someone like Fyodor Dostoevsky, who viewed the Jews as a global conspiracy. Now, I've pinched this quotation from him from P.J. Duncan's book Russian Messianism, but he's quoting Dostoevsky. It's not for nothing that everywhere there, he means Europe in the sense that doesn't include Russia. Many Russians will speak about Europe in a sense that doesn't include themselves. Everywhere there, the Jews are reigning over the stock exchanges, control capital, are masters of credit, and are masters of all international politics. And what will be in the future is known also to the Jews themselves. Their reign is approaching, their complete reign. And then elsewhere, the Jew and his bank are now reigning over everything, over Europe, education, civilization, socialism, especially socialism, for he will use it to uproot Christianity and destroy its civilization. And when nothing but anarchy remains, the Jew will be in command of everything. Now, it's not just that these statements are really obnoxious, though obviously they are, but particularly that last couple of sentences there, it's difficult to see that they actually mean anything. When nothing but anarchy remains, the Jew will be in command of everything. Well, if there is anarchy, nobody's in command. That's what anarchy means. It doesn't mean anything rationally or sensibly. What it really means is that he really hates the Jews. That's all you can draw from that. It's not a rational discourse in that sense at all. It's just like a scream, perhaps.
And this Dostoevsky is the famous novelist that we're talking about, right? Isn't he, regarded as something of a bit of a hero in Christian circles? Maybe we're dealing with the same same issue that we found in Luther as last week.
Yeah,
That's a pretty strong statement.
Exactly that. Yeah, he's considered a hero because of his critique of the bad aspects of modernity and the way it was hollowing out a civilization, the way that it was making everything and everybody extremely materialistic, even as it was producing more goods. And it was chiselling away at all of the old relationships that bound people to one another. And he was very good at that. So many Christians appreciate him for that. But, yeah, as you say, it's a little like the situation we found with Luther. Many Christians want to hold him as some kind of a hero, but then you look at this and you think, by gum, yes, we can't be doing with this. So, yeah, we have to take people, as it were, in the round. Well, let's move on to look at the daddy of all conspiracy theories. And this is a poisonous work from 1903 called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, I have got the text here, but it's very long and extremely tedious and tiresome, so we're not going to dive into that. We're just going to make a few statements about it. It was first published in Russia in 1903, and it claimed to be a program produced by important Jewish leaders, though it didn't name any, because it couldn't, because the fakeness of the whole thing would have been exploded at once, aiming at world domination. And it popularised belief in a Jewish conspiracy. It was exposed as a forgery in 1921. In fact, it is partly plagiarised. Plagiarism is not entirely new. From earlier writings that weren't actually even not anti-Semitic. It is from if I remember correctly, I think it was from a novel, large chunks of it, not all of it, but bits of it. But despite this, Henry Ford paid for the printing and the distribution of 500,000 copies in the United States in the 1920s, for which he was given awards by the Nazis, who really appreciated him for this. And I'm sorry to tell you that even though it's long since been exploded, people believe what they want to believe. And it remains a bestseller today in Egypt. In fact, I was talking to a friend here in Croatia just a few months ago, mentioning this, and she said, some friend of hers had excitedly told her about this new, extremely interesting book he had discovered. What was it? The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So it's still doing the rounds. Very, very tenacious.
So this is a book that's not anti-Semitic in nature, but because it's painting the Jews as sort of this radical kind of group, it would have sparked a lot of anti-Semitism.
Oh no, it's anti-Semitic to its core. It's written as though by Jews, right? But the whole purpose is to float the idea of a Jewish conspiracy to bring about world domination, whatever that even means. Yeah, that was the whole core of it. There was nothing remotely innocent about it. So many people believed this even long after it had been. I think any fairly sensible person could have gone over it and said, "Wait a minute, there's enough here to make me think this is false flag operation," But a few years later, in 1921, this was definitively proved. But of course, loads of people don't want to believe that. They prefer to cling on to their hatreds, as we still find today, right? That rational discussion is almost pointless in some cases. And that brings us to the general idea of conspiracy theories. Are conspiracy theories just the discourse of the feeble-minded? And I really, really would love to just answer a definitive yes to that question. But it has to be admitted that a lot of conspiracists expend immense and completely wasted intellectual energy in defending and elaborating such theories. And more important is that conspiracy theories, I think, are the discourse of the disempowered, where people feel that they have no control over their lives, over their economic fortunes, their social fortunes. What conspiracy theories do is they console people and they give an explanation and they locate someone to blame, and always that someone is people not like us, right? And that last reason, of course, is why they're dangerous. And I mean, for that, we've only got to look at the news today. This is going on all around us all the time. It's not just QAnon. There's any number of conspiracist type pseudo explanations or non-explanations for pretty much everything that's going on. And once you've bought into one, then you've got the whole mindset to just default to that constantly, right? Everything's a fake. But my intelligence has somehow penetrated that and can see this for what it is. It's very foolish and very sad. It's very difficult to argue with because people are extremely good at finding people and developing extremely kind of complex little arguments and so on. So and this, I'm afraid, is the daddy of the lot. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Oh my goodness. Well, I've said that anti-Semitism is worst in the east of Europe, in the borderlands, the western borderlands of the Russian Empire, Poland and so on. It's slightly less bad in Germany, slightly less bad again in France and Britain, but it's present everywhere and can be quite virulent. So what we have here is a French election poster of 1889 drumming up support for the anti-Semitic candidate. Now, it was a perfectly respectable thing to say, apparently. You could campaign on that basis and hope to get votes accordingly. And in particular, the anti-Semitic atmosphere in France led to the famous or notorious case of Alfred Dreyfus, who was a French army officer from Alsace-Lorraine, I think, and he was accused of leaking military secrets to the Germans. Now, Germany had just defeated France in the War of 1870-71, taken Alsace-Lorraine away from it. And many people, I think we can say most people in France, were expecting a round two at some stage in which they would get their revenge, which was the First World War when it happened. So Dreyfus was accused of being secretly in the pay of the Germans and leaking military secrets to them. This picture here from Le Petit Journal is a French anti-Semitic newspaper portraying Dreyfus' demotion and humiliation, and he was in fact imprisoned on a prison island, and the leaks continued and in the same handwriting as before. So whoever it was, it obviously wasn't Dreyfus. And notoriously, the French military top brass stood on their dignity and said that Dreyfus was nevertheless guilty, and the people who were saying that it wasn't were bringing the honour of the French military into disrepute. And this whole case tore France apart, French politics apart, in the late 1890s, early 1900s. It's a classic case of passionate anti-Semitism, I suppose we can say.
And Dreyfus never got the justice that he deserved, I suppose.
Well, yes, in the end he did, but it took a long time. He was released, he was pardoned, maybe he didn't need to be pardoned, reinstated anyway, and he served and fought for France through the First World War and survived it. So, yeah, you can say that he was vindicated in the end, but certainly the paroxysms to to get there were considerable. Well, just a reminder of the situation on the east of the continent. I think we looked at these couple of maps last time, but just refreshing our memories here. We've got the Pale of Settlement in Western Russia and Poland from the time of Catherine the Great in the late 18th century. That was when the very large, long-standing kingdom of Poland was torn apart by its three greedy neighbours, Prussia, Russia and Austria. And Russia got the lion's share, including the central zone of Poland, as you can see from the map there. And this included a load of Jews. And that the Pale of Settlement, where Jews were allowed to live, consisted basically of territories taken from Poland and the Ottoman Empire. Catherine's Russia had not had any significant number of Jews before this, but there were large concentrations there. And the next map shows the general concentration of Jews. So in some areas, the darkest shaded red there, they were more than 17% of the population. And again, this is something we looked at last time, but just by way of refreshing ourselves, rural Jews in those territories were often leaseholders, renting from Polish landlords the right to run farmland, mills, dairies, orchards, taverns. They were often tax collectors and financial agents, liquor dealers, estate managers. Now, the effect of that was to make these people middlemen between the landowners and the peasants, and so hated by the latter, because if you're a peasant and you're fed up at having to pay this charge, pay that charge, pay tax and so on, pay rent, who is it that you're actually giving it to? Who's at the sharp end dealing with you? And the particular downside of this is that whereas before the Polish rulers had been protective of the Jews, the new Russian rulers were not. And they saw it as a cheap play for publicity to claim to be on the side of ordinary people against these Jewish sharks. And this led to some terrible situations. Just to take a classic quote, for example, Konstantin Pobyedonoscev was, and I've practiced saying that name any number of times because I generally trip over it. He was a very senior civil servant and chief procurator of the Holy Synod for since the time of Peter the Great until the 20th century. There was no patriarch in Moscow. It was run by a secular civil servant, and this guy was a dreadful reactionary man, and he's cited as saying a third of Russia's Jews will be converted, a third will emigrate, and a third will die of hunger. He didn't do too much about that, but that certainly was his sentiment, and that was right at the top of Russian government. A quick by the way here to people who might be listening to this from the Balkans area, that expression will ring some bells, because an even more obnoxious man, Mile Budak, who was a minister in the Ustasha Croatian fascist government during World War II, said almost exactly that about the Serbs living in Croatia. So convert a third, expel a third, kill a third. Okay, well, the anti-Semitism wasn't just at the top, it was at the bottom. And in the early 20th century, an organisation known as the Black Hundreds, we've got some pictures of them here, conducted various pogroms, massacres in a whole load of towns in the south and west of the Russian Empire against local Jews. We've got a report here from the New York Times in 1903, which is cited actually in this book. This is called Easter, I'm trying to get it so the light doesn't... Right, Easter in Kishinev by Edward Judge, about the massacre there. But this is frankly typical of a whole load of massacres going on in the beginning of the 20th century. Well, the New York Times reports the anti-Jewish riots in Kishinev, Bessarabia. Bessarabia is what we would now call Moldova, are worse than the censor will permit to publish. There was a well laid out plan for the general massacre of Jews on the day following the Russian Easter. The mob was led by priests, and the general cry, "Kill the Jews," was taken up all over the city. Jews were taken wholly unaware and were slaughtered like sheep. The dead number 120 and injured about 500. The scenes of horror attending this massacre are beyond description. You can see I put some dots there because there was a description of some of it. It was pretty stomach-churning. The local police made no attempt to check the reign of terror. At sunset, the streets were piled with corpses and wounded. Those who could make their escape fled in terror, and the city is now practically deserted of Jews. And our next rather horrible picture, I'm afraid, shows the corpses of some of the 80 or more Jews killed in a pogrom the following year in Białystok in Poland, Russian Poland, laid out outside the Jewish hospital. 63% of the town's population of 66,000 was Jewish. So you can say, well, that's what, 45,000 people. So 80, well, okay, it's not a high proportion, but nevertheless, it was an expression of extreme violence. You know, it's not a small riot to kill 80 people.
I thought that the late Russian Empire was notorious for being the most repressive state in Europe. I mean, how did these guys get away with holding demonstrations and whipping up hatred?
Right. Well, because they are actually getting a nudge and a wink from government as a way of diverting popular grievances from other things that might have been destabilising to the government. And the fact that the police are involved, at one level that's not so surprising because police constables in most societies tend to be recruited from fairly low down in society, the kind of people who might have sympathised with the rioters, but at the same time police are subject to whoever's above them, so they're not going to actually help unless they know that there's not going to be any blowback towards them from seniors and then from above them and so on. So yeah, it's getting a kind of like a nudge and a wink from the top. And finally from the Tsar, I mean, we've got writings from Nicholas II to show that, you know, he was really anti-Semitic himself. So yeah, it's like a perfect storm, I suppose, particularly from a Jewish point of view. Now, not all Jews were necessarily rich, but not by any means. Many were very poor. Like, for example, this family in Jędrzejów, I think that's how we pronounce it, in Russian Poland around 1900. And they're living in, well, Jędrzejów is just an ordinary town, but many of them living particularly in little exclusively Jewish towns, or what were called shtetls. Now, the shtetl was like a whole institution. That's by Eva Hoffman, by the way. There we are. A lot of people, perhaps my age and older, will have been familiarised with this, if they weren't already, through the famous musical Fiddler on the Roof with the star Topol. Right, that was set in a Jewish shtetl in the early 20th century. Think of the German word Stadt, which means a town, and the diminutive of that little town, Städtlein or Städtli. So a shtetl is a little town. So in this case, a Jewish one. Whilst we're recommending books, this one is pretty super. It's by Paul Krivacek, that's right, A Yiddish Civilization, which again looks at shtetls in particular, but the whole spread of Yiddish civilizations, including in the cities during this period. Well, if we want to get a flavour for this, why it was so easy to whip up resentment, let's look at the concentration of Jews and where they were. So we've got several little charts here. In Romania, 80% of the population worked in agriculture. Only 2% of all Jews did so. Only 10% of the population as a whole worked in trade and industry, but 80% of Jews did so. Only 10% of the population lived in urban areas. 80% of Jews lived in urban areas. And you can see that even if the proportion of Jews in the whole population is pretty small, they could easily be a third or a half or even a majority in many of the towns. And that situation applied right across whole swathes of East Central Europe. Take Vienna, for example. Jews in 1914 were only 8 to 9% of the population, but they were more than half of all lawyers, 3/4 of journalists, 28% of university students, and between 90% and 100% of furniture, retailing and advertising firms. Well, you couldn't live in Vienna and not notice that fact. Or take the other capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Budapest, which was called by Karl Lueger, the anti-Semitic mayor of Vienna, Judapest, which is his idea of a joke. So Jewish pest is plague. So a plague of Jews. They were 25% of the population in the city, but 66% of all shopkeepers, 57% of service workers and bank clerks, 45% of journalists and lawyers, 49% of medical doctors, 24% of high school teachers, which is pretty much exactly what they should have been, and a third of university students. So about or slightly above representation of those last two categories, way above for everything else. So if I'm working in one of these new industries and perhaps got a pretty nasty job in a mill or a factory or something like that, particularly if that is owned by somebody Jewish, I'll feel that my interests have nothing in common with Jews in general, and they're going to be an outlet for my resentments. Again, let's have a look at this Polish anti-Semitic cartoon of the 1920s. So the idea there is that the Jews are extremely fat and well fed and rich, and ordinary people are not. That's the central message there.
So if you're working in agriculture, or as you said, in a mill or something, and you go into town for the things that you need, and you sort of see the Jewish person in the store or maybe in a bank or something like that, you start to feel like they really are living a different quality of life than you, because they're not out working in the fields,
right,
12 hours a day.
Right. And yet, of course, ironically, this isn't the case for all Jews at all. A lot of them live in shtetls like this, where they'll have been darn poor, living in the world of Fiddler on the Roof. If I were a rich man. But nevertheless, it's the kind of like the averages that count, right? And on average, there's far more Jews in these prosperous positions, running businesses, owning businesses, involved in the world of high finance, all these nice new professions like journalism and the law, where you don't have to get your hands dirty, and so on. And that means that there's a possibility of cranking up resentment.
Yeah, not to mention that those positions would have been some of the most visible.
Yes. The sign on the front of the shops. I mean, even today, if I'm going to let slip how nerdy I am here, but one of my hobbies, one of my few hobbies, is collecting digitized and well-colorized versions of old photographs from all over the place. And when you get these from, say, the early 20th century, of various towns in Central and Eastern Europe, and you just look at the names on the shops. The names on the shops are always German or Jewish. Not always, but overwhelmingly. Right? And that, again, is what will have hit people straight away at the time who are living there. That the people who are prospering, the people who are running the businesses, the people from whom I have to buy stuff, they're not like me.
Right.
Well, just moving quickly here through a number of pictures that I'd like us to see if we can. In the late 1930s, a Jewish, I think he was an American photographer, Roman Vishniak, was commissioned by a Jewish organisation in the US to record Jewish life in Central and Eastern Europe. We have loads of pictures by him. I've just selected a few of the best here. So like this one showing this Jewish woman and her grandfather in Warsaw. These are part of a vanished way of life. These children in Mukachevo in, Czechoslovakia, as it was then, and nowadays it's in Western Ukraine. And between the wars, the town's population was almost 50% Jewish. Another picture of Jewish women from the same town here. And children, again, from the same town. This shows David Eckstein, who's 7 years old, in a cheder, which is like a Jewish elementary school in Brod, in Czechoslovakia. In fact, we know a bit about him personally. He survived Belsen and Auschwitz, amazingly enough, although apart from one sibling, the rest of his family were killed in the Holocaust, and in the early 1950s he settled in Woodstock, New York. So the next picture shows some pictures of little girls here from an East European town, and then the next one, Jewish girl from Łódź in Poland, the bottle of milk. Now, moving beyond Wiśniak, this is an anti-Semitic demonstration in Poland in the late 1930s. This is one thing you need to bear in mind before we start thinking about how World War II starts with the Nazis invading Poland, right? A lot of resentment between Poles and Germans, but one thing that won't have offended a lot of Poles at least is anti-Semitism. They will have been prepared to go along with the conquerors in that, or many of them will. This next picture is from the town where I live, in Osijek in eastern Croatia, part of Yugoslavia, Royal Yugoslavia then. And these are employees of the J.J. Spitzer textile importing firm, one of the biggest firms in town at that time. The Spitzers were a very influential Jewish family in town. And the next picture shows several family members in the late 1930s. They were around 5% of the city's population at the time. So not the kind of high concentrations we find in, say, Galicia, then southeastern Poland, now western Ukraine, those kind of places, but still significant. The next is a nasty German anti-Semitic cartoon, the Golden Calf, so the biblical idea from the Book of Exodus, but it portrays the Jews as milking Europe, and Weltbank, World Bank, so again the idea of Jewish world domination. And then we come to a couple of cartoons that seem just bizarre to us. This is a piece of Nazi propaganda from before they'd seized power. So List 1, List 1, they're still running for elections because there are still elections happening after the Nazis seized power. Obviously there aren't any elections. And it says that Marxism is the guardian angel of capitalism, which to us, and indeed to anybody who's lived most of their lives after World War II, will seem bizarre and even ludicrous. Surely these two things are opposites. They are the alternatives. But what they have in common is that they are modern ways of life. They are modern economic systems. And both of them threaten people whose livelihoods have been destroyed by the rise of new technology, the rise of big business with which their traditional small-scale handcraft businesses can't possibly compete, this kind of thing. And those people are very prone to listen to the Nazi message or to its equivalents in other countries. So it doesn't seem so nonsensical to them. And crucially, although it's not quite obvious from this cartoon, both of them could be seen as dominated by Jews. The capitalist there, who's being led along by the hand, has got the sort of supposedly Jewish hook nose. That's a cartoon Jew. That's not quite as obvious in respect of the Bolshevik with his Bolshevik cap there. Not that communists believe much in angels, but there we are. But you see it again in this next poster, which is for the anti-Masonic exhibition in Nazi-occupied Serbia during World War II. And it portrays capitalism and communism as being weights in a scale being manipulated by the Jews. That's the point. We'll leave the anti-Masonic stuff aside, that's just complicating things further. But the point of that poster is that the Jew is manipulating both Marxism, communism, and capitalism, and holding them both in the balance, and has got them both under his control.
This seems, absolutely insane. Somehow the Jews are supposed to be blamed for capitalism and communism. I mean, how is that even supposed to be possible? Why didn't people sort of see the ridiculousness of this?
Well, because it will have chimed with their experience. As I've said, not all Jews were rich by any means, although I should say that lots of people, not just Jews but Gentiles too, who got involved with the communist movement were not necessarily poor by any means. Lots of them were middle class boys and girls who were paying out their parents for being their parents, a phenomenon we've observed in the decades since World War II and continue to observe, but let's not go there for now. Nevertheless, the idea of being for the working classes, there will have been plenty of Jews who will want that kind of drastic break with traditional society that communism represents, and Jews were certainly overrepresented in communist parties and communist party leaderships the world over, and they're overrepresented amongst bankers and journalists, and with the advent of Hollywood, as we still find, in Hollywood and the entertainment industry and so on. So it's not as lunatic as it seems to us. And what both of those things have in common is that they're fundamentally extremely modern ways of life, modern ideas about the economy. They are a radical break from the past. And as we said at the beginning, Jews, for many Jews, society couldn't modernise fast enough to get away from the old world that had treated them so badly. So there was plenty of material there for very modern kinds of anti-Semitism. With the religious stuff still there, capable of being deployed in the background when demagogues like Hitler wanted to, but it's entirely ancillary to their central arguments, which were the kinds of things we've been looking at here. Well, this map shows us the Jewish distribution of population. I think we looked at this last time as well, but it's good to remind ourselves. Around 1933, so there's over 500,000 Jews in Germany. There's 3 million in Poland, and about 2.5 million in the Soviet Union. Those are the really big concentrations, but certainly plenty in other countries as well. And of course, just going to our last map, 6 million Jews are killed during the course of the Holocaust, and very many leave afterwards. Many of those who survive leave afterwards, particularly to America and to Israel. And Israel is what we're going to be looking at next time. We're going to look at the rise of Zionism and the British mandate in Palestine, and then the creation of the state of Israel in 1948. But that's for next week. So do tune in again, folks.
Hey everybody, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this episode of A Foggy Day on Olympus, then please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can press the black button that says subscribe, and or you can follow our Facebook page to make sure you stay up to date with all of our future vodcasts and other events. It's free. And if you can repost this link to your social media, we're trying to spread the word about having calm, rational discussions in a time of growing madness. Thanks a lot.